say, you're asking the wrong question. The question is, what are you doing here? This church has been here for 102 years.
If you drive northwest out of Washington, D.C., after about 30 minutes, you'll get to Bethesda, Maryland, a very wealthy, very white suburb of about 70,000 people. There are art galleries and shopping centers, and the city is lush and full of nature, with trees, greenways, and trickling creeks. And as you turn onto a busy street called River Road, if you're not looking closely, you could easily miss a tiny white building sitting in the shadow of a high-rise apartment building, the Macedonia Baptist Church.
So this is also known as the little church on top of a hill.
Marcia Coleman Adebayo is originally from Detroit, but she's now the First Lady of Macedonia. Her husband, Reverend Segun Adebayo, is the church's pastor. Next door is a drive-through Bank of America. Storage facilities and gas stations line both sides of the street, along with more apartments and condos reaching high into the sky. The church looks like a relic from another time, because it is.
This church has been the center of the community. Not only is it the spiritual center, it's the life of this community.
Bethesda is less than 5% black, and it's the only black church in the city. Bethesda's always been mostly white, but not long ago, before violence and gentrification drove black people out, River Road was at the heart of a thriving black community.
So this church was situated after emancipation in an all-white enclave, and they would come together at this place for comfort and for love and community.
Macedonia Baptist Church is pretty small. It has about 70 loyal members, most of whom moved away over the years, but still come back to River Road for services. Marcia's husband became pastor here 7 years ago.
And my first responsibility as First Lady was to go to a meeting at the Montgomery County Parks and Planning Commission. And their goal was for me to sign what they call a sector plan.
In the spring of 2016, representatives from the Montgomery County Planning Commission were holding a series of meetings with local community groups, trying to get their buy-in on a pretty radical idea. A new vision for the neighborhood, including zoning changes that would allow for lucrative development opportunities. Marcia was still a brand new member of the community, and she felt a little out of her depth.
And so I'm sitting at this meeting. I am not from this area. I'm actually from Detroit, Michigan. And so I didn't really have the history of this area. And they're explaining to me why I should sign this on behalf of the church.
Then at one point, the tone of the meeting shifted.
And as they're describing how there's a rumor, a myth that some Black people could be buried somewhere in this area, that it was, I think the word they kept using was, it's alleged that there's some Black people who used to live in that area.
The representative was talking about some land, roughly the size of a football field, not far from the church. Decades earlier, it had been partially paved over to make a parking lot for an apartment building. The rest was still an overgrown patch of land. Marcia was shocked. There could be an historic Black cemetery with connections to her church, maybe even with the ancestors of her congregation, laying under some nondescript patch of brush and asphalt. Marcia remembers the representative who mentioned it seemed to downplay the possibility.
But sitting next to me was a man named Harvey Matthews.
So while we was in that particular meeting, the subject came up. Do you have any comments? Have anything to say?
Harvey Matthews, who was born in Bethesda in 1944 and raised right here on River Road, when it was a small but prosperous Black community, certainly had something to say.
Harvey Matthews raised his hand very politely and said, "Excuse me, madam, that's not an alleged cemetery."
I don't know where you gather your information from. But you cannot sit here and tell me, born and raised there on River Road, and you want to sit here and tell me you allege that there's a cemetery there in them clay hills. You cannot tell me that. Sir, I lived it. I played in it. Cemetery is there.
When Harvey was a kid, playing in the grassy area around the cemetery, it was just common knowledge that black folks were buried there.
So you cannot sit here and tell me there was alleged.
Harvey was forcing the Planning Commission to look at something he got the sense they wanted to turn away from. That in the early 20th century, this was a cemetery, and some of those remains could still be there. The existence of these remains on this land would make it much more difficult to develop on. Marcia remembers sensing their unease.
I worked in the federal government for 18 years. So I'm very in tune with the way people sort of exchange glances. And when I saw the bureaucrats all exchanging glances, I sat back and I said, "Excuse me, can you tell me where the members of my church are now buried?" And they said, "Oh, well, we're not really sure." And I said, "Okay, then we have a crime scene on our hands. If you don't know where those bodies are located, then we have a crime scene." At that point, the meeting broke up. And they said, "I don't think we want to talk about this anymore."
In an email to us, the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission acknowledged that the land was at one point a cemetery. What's in dispute is whether or not there are still remains there. The county saw this land as a valuable asset, potentially worth millions of dollars, and part of their plan to remake the neighborhood in tandem with developers. But it had a different kind of value to Harvey Matthews and other black people with roots on River Road. Marcia joined the fight.
I determined that I would do everything in my power to stop the atrocity that's occurring here on River Road.
Marcia didn't know it yet, but that meeting was the start of an all-encompassing legal battle with local government over the future of those old cemetery grounds.
And so I started organizing. And I started with the churches, then I started with civic organizations, and then I started with everyone who would listen to me. And I literally, it became like an obsession.
I'm Tremaine Lee, and this is Into America. Today, the story of how a tiny black church is taking on one of the wealthiest counties in the country to reclaim an old burial ground, one of the only remaining connections the congregants have left to their once thriving community.
A whole black community, a loving, devoted, dedicated community. They'll have all that taken away.
If the courts rule against us, it will be open season on black land.
A record 100 million people have been forced to flee their homes. This is the worst refugee crisis in recent history. As winter comes, millions of these refugees will need help to survive the freezing cold. Your kindness is a life-saving gift of warmth for refugees enduring a cruel, bitter cold winter. Please, donate to USA for UNHCR. If you give before December 31st, your donation will be matched. Visit unrefugees.org/winter.
She has been called education's public enemy #1. And though she's never gone to college, when Norma Gabler speaks, the education establishment of the state of Texas listens.
If you went to a public school anywhere in America, there's a fair chance that some of your textbooks were made specifically for the state of Texas. This is the surprising history behind America's latest culture war. I'm Grace Lynch, host of the new audio documentary, Teaching Texas. Listen to Teaching Texas wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, describe this. So obviously right now it's a little overgrown. There's some asphalt here. But what did this look like when you were growing up?
This was a gravel road. Right back again. Going up to Mr. Woods' them house, Mr. Rivers' house.
Mr. Harvey Matthews and I are standing in the parking lot of the Westwood apartment towers, where the Moses Macedonia African Cemetery used to be. He still remembers what it looked like before the land was paved over.
With 3 houses up on top of this steep hill, right? This all we was, a steep hill. And you went across a wooden bridge here. Then we went up there, cutting through the cemetery on this side. And that gravel road came right straight down beside the McDonald's, where the McDonald's is. But it wasn't a McDonald's back there then. It was a Roy Rogers. It was a Roy Rogers back there then. Then it came later on and converted into McDonald's, what you had there now. But this always was a gravel road.
The asphalt gently slopes down to an overgrown creek area, which also used to be part of the cemetery. A high-rise apartment tower built in the late 60s looms over all of this. We're just a couple blocks from the church, but because of the busy intersections, construction sites, and fenced-off areas near the parking lot, you can't walk there directly. Harvey gestures over to some bushes that seem to be especially green and lush.
We had some people come in there, survey the land, and they told us, let me tell you something. You see that hill right there? He said, if I go over and expose that hill right there, what you're seeing is human remains that's growing there. He said, that's what's keeping it so green and so fertilized and whatnot. It's because that's what that is. He said, now if you go over and explore that, then that's what you'll find.
The bones of the ancestors are still nourishing this soil. The Macedonia Baptist Church and what's left of the cemetery are all that remains of the once flourishing Black community here on River Road.
And this was a
two-lane highway, not 4 like you see now. It's just 2 lanes, north and south.
Wow.
Harvey and I have gone a couple minutes down River Road to where his childhood home used to stand. Now, it's just another parking lot. This one for a Whole Foods grocery store.
So this was all your family's property. Your yard was here, the steps,
yeah.
And this tree.
That tree is the one that my mom and my dad planted right there when I was about 9 years old.
Whole Foods customers walk by the tall sycamore every day, not knowing it was planted by the Black family that used to call this place home. Harvey's father would record his kids' heights every year on this very tree.
And they used to measure your height with this?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's hard to picture now, but this parking lot that is filled with nice cars and SUVs used to be a farm.
And all back here where the barn was, where we kept the horse.